Welcome. We're glad that you're joining us again for our devotional today. Have you ever wondered, who is my neighbor? Jesus was asked that question by a lawyer on one occasion in Luke chapter 10, and his answer was a story of the Good Samaritan. The man that fell among thieves was there, and a priest and a Levite came by, and neither one helped him. But then a Samaritan, someone of the race that the Jews looked down upon, that they despised and referred to them as dogs. A Samaritan came by and had pity and showed compassion for the man. He tended to his wounds. He took him to an inn and kept him there and paid for his time to recover. When we think about that story, Jesus says, "Go and do likewise." In Galatians chapter 6, we have some examples. In our lives here on earth, there will never be a time that we will not have burdens. Now, that may not sound positive, but God gives us the instruction as to how to deal with those burdens, how to be good neighbors, and how to be neighborly. In Galatians chapter 5 and verse 14, Paul said that the law is fulfilled in one word, to love your neighbor as yourself. We are to love one another and to care for one another. And so as Paul goes on after talking about walking in the Spirit and not according to the flesh says, just take care of yourself. Look out for number one. The Spirit says, no, we're in this together and we need to help each other. So listen to Paul's instruction in Galatians chapter 6, verses 1 through 5. Brethren, if a man is overtaken in a trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in the spirit of gentleness, considering yourself, lest you also be tempted. Bear one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. For if anyone thinks himself to be something, when he is nothing, he deceives himself. But let each one examine his own work, and then he will have rejoicing in himself, and not in another. For each one shall bear his own burden. When we hear this instruction of Paul, we wonder, well, Paul, how can it be this way or that way? I want you to think about the burdens of life and how we can share the load or what we're supposed to do with each burden. In verse 2, when Paul talks about the trespass, someone who has fallen into temptation, into sin, and they need help getting out of it. They need to recognize their sin. They need help to acknowledge their sin, admit the mistakes and the trespasses. That is, that they've gone outside of the territory that God established. And in crossing that boundary, they've not only broken their relationship with God, but they've injured possibly others in that same step as well. So he says, bear one another's burdens. In that passage, this idea of mutual burden bearing, Paul's talking about a load that's too big for one person to carry. Just a couple of verses later, Paul's going to say that it's a self-help. There's the mutual help that we cannot bear the loads of life unaided. We can't go through life alone. We bear one another's burdens. But then there are times that there are those things that are smaller. And the word that Paul uses in Galatians 6 and verse 5 for a burden is the idea of a backpack. It's something that should be carried by the individual. A soldier, a Roman soldier, had his own backpack. And it was wrong for him to expect one of his fellow soldiers to carry the load that he was intended to carry. But then there were other times that there were loads too big for any one person, and they had to share those loads. Mutual burden bearing, self-burden bearing. And then there are those times that the loads are too great for all of us. Even working together, we cannot take all those burdens away. And what the psalmist says in Psalm 55 and verse 22, casting all your care upon the Lord, because he cares for you. He, in other words, will sustain you. That passage is also repeated in 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 7. Mutual burden bearing, self-burden bearing, and then the Lord bearing the burdens. If we learn these three principles, maybe you want to write them down. Maybe each time you have a burden that you realize is something that you're struggling with, ask yourself, is this my burden? Is this something I need some mutual help to carry this burden? Or is this something I cast upon the Lord and I leave it there? COVID-19 is a time when we have to cast some things on the Lord and leave them there, because we by ourselves and even all the human beings on the earth cannot make all of this pandemic go away. We need to learn that there are times like this that we have to bear our own burdens, self-burden bearing. Then there are times we need help. And that's what the church is there for. And our brothers and sisters, we love you and we want to help you. If you are bearing something that you just are struggling and you cannot bear it alone and you need some mutual help, please reach out to us. Reach out to a brother or sister, or call one of the elders. Call Craig or call me. We would love to be able to help you if we possibly can. If we find that it's something we can cast upon the Lord, we can pray together and let the Lord take that burden. Remember, to be a good neighbor, we want to be able to fulfill what God has told us and to love our neighbor as ourselves. We want to do what the Samaritan did to help that man who fell among the thieves. And Jesus instructed, go and do likewise. Until the next time, be safe and be healthy, and may God bless you this day as your burdens are not too much for one of these ways to bear them. May God bless you.